A kétpólusú világrend felbomlását követően az Amerikai Egyesült Államok globális hegemón szerep kialakítására törekedett. Ehhez uralma alá kívánta vonni a politikai, gazdasági és kulturális teret is. A nyugati modell azonban mára nem mindenki számára kétségbevonhatatlanul követendő példa, amely megkérdőjelezte a jelenleg fennálló világrendet. Kína képében Amerika számára új kihívóakat a világ vezető szerepéért folyó küzdelemben, amely nem független az egyre erőteljesebb multipolarizációtól sem. Jó napot kívánok, köszöntöm kedves vendégeinket, ezek lesznek a mai Mozgásban extra témái David P. Goldmannel, az Asia Times szerkesztő helyettesével. Mr. Goldman, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and having you with us today.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you for inviting me.
So as I mentioned, the United States of America tried to establish a unipolar world when the bipolar world order fell apart, but China posed a fresh threat to all this. So the current focal points of this so-called new conflict, new Cold War between the US and China are Taiwan and Ukraine. How do you see, how do the struggle for the world leadership at the present and in the past differ from one another?
Well, as Forrest Gump said, stupid is as stupid does. And to the extent American policy has been stupid in a number of areas, we'll suffer from it. But I'd actually like to step back and talk about what made for such great American power. 30 years ago, America was the only superpower in the world. China, at that point, had a per capita GDP of a few $100s per year. It now, in US dollar terms, has a per capita GDP of about 12,600. But if you adjust that for the buying power of the currency, it's probably more like $17,000. That compares to a per capita GDP in the US of $68,000. So China's come a long way, but there's a long way to go. Now, there are two main elements of world power. One is military power, the other is economic power. And of course, 30 years ago, the United States was absolutely dominant. The United States won the Cold War. We did that not only by spending a lot of money on armaments, but also by reinventing technology. What we call the digital economy was mainly the product of America's effort to win the Cold War. So every important technology we have, microchips, optical networks, plasma displays, the internet, all started with a Defense Department subsidy to industry for a military purpose. And that combination of military and economic power with an emphasis on dual-use technologies gave us absolute domination. 30 years ago, if you were a smart Indian or Chinese or Hungarian entrepreneur, you came to the United States, you studied at MIT or Stanford, you went to American venture capitalists, you started a company in the United States. That's obviously changed in a big way. The United States became complacent with its accomplishments and neglected its manufacturing industry in particular. And we found that we could make fabulous amounts of money on consumer entertainment technologies. So Apple Computer, our most valuable company, is an entertainment company. It creates an ecosystem which draws you into its music and its films and its other amusements, and does very well. The world has been giving its money to the United States for 30 years. We have taken $16 trillion worth of capital from the rest of the world, net. And the reason is we have an aging population around the world. The need to invest savings for retirement is enormous. And the United States has been the safest and most profitable venue to do that. So we decided we don't need to manufacture anything. We'll simply import our manufacturers and we'll sell people our assets because everybody wants American assets. That system worked well until quite recently. What's changed, above all, is China. We are now in the middle of a new industrial revolution. If you think of the first industrial revolution as steam, the second as electricity, the third as computers, the fourth industrial revolution is artificial intelligence as applied to the real economy. Automated ports, automated factories, automated farms, autonomous vehicles, and so forth. China is sadly ahead of the United States in many of these fields. The United States is still by far the dominant player in terms of semiconductor technology. But in the applications of that technology to manufacturing or transport, China is well ahead of us. So that threatens America's position, and we see a multipolar world developing where a trading zone is developing around China and the global South, independent of the United States. So the world is really becoming two important blocks at this point. Now, military power is related to this. China is generally accused of having hegemonic world ambitions. This is complicated because China, to my knowledge, has exactly 200 soldiers deployed outside of China. There are Marines sitting in Djibouti, which is China's only base outside China. The United States, of course, has hundreds of bases outside the United States. But China has also invested massively in defense of its coasts with missiles, submarines, drones, and other high technology. So for the first time, America's power in the Pacific is probably number 2 to China. China probably outguns the United States in its home theater. So that creates an instability around Taiwan, which is potentially very dangerous.
Who do you think will prevail in this new Cold War? Does it mean that China might prevail this new conflict?
When you say prevail, I hope, I'm an American, I hope America remains the strongest power. I would like to see China prosperous and secure and weaker than the United States. But as things are going, China's power is increasing relative to the United States almost by the month. And I think it would take a significant change in American policy for us to stay ahead of China. China is really catching up quickly.
And parallelly, the United States of America can succeed to keep its control and keep its position to some extent?
Oh, the United States is not going away. This is a matter of two blocks developing, where one is gaining power, the other is losing power, but the United States will not disappear.
What characteristics best describe these two blocks?
Well, for example, one number stands out in my mind. As of the beginning of this year, for the first time, China exported more to the global South than it did to all developed markets. China's exports to the global South are 4 times its exports to the United States. In 2007, China exported 9% of its GDP to the United States. So when Donald Trump said the United States made China's growth possible, there's some truth to that. A long time ago, China's development in the 2000s certainly was very much driven by its exports to the United States. But now China's exports to the United States are only about 2% of its GDP. And its exports to the global South are more like 8% of its GDP. And more important than the size of exports is the content. China has become the world leader in one of the definitive technologies of the 21st century, which is mobile broadband. China's Huawei and ZTE are the world leaders in telecom infrastructure. Now, for the global South, this is a transformative technology. We're talking about billions of people who live at the margin of the world market. They don't have access to credit. They don't have access to public services. They live on $2 or $3 per day. Health and education are abysmal. And what broadband does is to take people who've been marginalized and bring them into the world market. It gives them access to information, access to markets, access to educational and health services. So the Chinese model is integrating very large numbers of people into the world economy, but into an economy dominated by China. So we see many large developing countries orienting towards China. Brazil is a good example. Brazil, which is part of the Western Hemisphere, America's backyard, is now trades more with China than with the US, and is looking to China for investments in its key infrastructure, including, of course, broadband. Their president, Lula, went to China a few weeks ago and talked about trading with China in its own currency instead of using the US dollar. This is a very big development. Indonesia, which is the largest country in Southeast Asia, with nearly 300 million people. China is its main trading partner. I heard a speaker from Indonesia at a conference in Budapest yesterday, where I also spoke, say that China is unstoppable. And China has done a very good job of localizing its technology and making it, adapting it to Indonesia's particular needs. And also, Chinese companies are mainly hiring local Indonesians. So China's done a very effective job in Southeast Asia, also Central Asia, parts of Latin America. Africa's a bit different because they're mainly interested in minerals. So a great deal of the global South is now orienting towards China. And then you've got the problem of Europe. The German auto companies are effectively becoming Chinese companies. Mm-hmm. Volkswagen sells more cars in China than it does in Germany. The main expansion of the German automakers has been in China. This, of course, is of great relevance to Hungary, because Hungary's single biggest industry is auto parts for the German market. And to the extent that the German auto industry orients towards China, Hungary has to think about its own future, because that industry clearly will change. So because of China's economic power and its very effective use of cutting-edge technologies for economic development, China has gained an enormous amount of economic power. Its military power is very much a regional issue. China cannot fight the United States anywhere far from China, but on its coast, it would probably win a war, a conventional war against the United States. That's something which has produced some panic in the American military. There was a report by the Defense Department in November 2022, which laid out the military balance in pretty compelling terms. So the United States can no longer give orders to China on China's coast. And that, as I said, could be a destabilizing issue, since the Taiwan problem remains unresolved.
You mentioned Donald Trump, so and I would like to going back just for a second to the trade war between the U.S. and China. So not even if not in its intensity, but the trade war between the U.S. and China brought a change when Donald Trump was replaced by Joe Biden as the president of the United States. What was the main reason of that? So what is the reason of this change?
Well, I don't think that, I'm not sure there's been that much of a change. The tariffs which Donald Trump put in place have not been changed. The controls on export of American technology to China, for example, high-end chips, software for designing chips, or machines that make chips, have been intensified by Biden. So the trade war remains, but paradoxically, we now import more from China than we did before the tariffs. Mm-hmm. And not only do we import more from China, Many of the imports that we get from third countries like Mexico or India or Vietnam have a very high Chinese content. In other words, these countries import components from China. They assemble goods and they sell them to the United States. So America's dependency on China has increased since the Trump tariffs, not decreased. We've done a study of that at Asia Times, and I'm told the World Bank is doing a comprehensive study which will demonstrate how great that dependency is. China's power in terms of manufacturing supply chains has increased in the past 3 years and increased considerably.
Clear. You're also talked about the emerging powers that are also the regional adversaries of China in this new Cold War. How do you see China will aim to be at the head of emerging powers, or will instead consent to the emergence of a multipolar world order? And does China have the main means or tools at its disposal to succeed?
Well, I think the Chinese idea of world power is very different from that of the United States. To some extent, we're talking about apples and oranges. Mm-hmm. China has never had allies, for example. Mm-hmm. It has specific deals with people, but there's no such thing as a Chinese ally. China has a loose association called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but that's nothing like NATO. China has shown no interest in deploying large amounts of soldiers, for example, to assert its influence. It's much more interested in economic power that it benefits from. You have a very complicated situation in Asia. Nobody likes each other. It's like the Balkans. Mm-hmm. The Indians and the Chinese have never liked each other. The Vietnamese hate the Chinese and so forth. But everyone does business when it suits them. So India, for example, was supposed to be a counterweight to China, a pro-Western strategic power that would limit China's influence. To some extent, that's true, but it's also the case that China is India's biggest trading partner, except for oil. India gets a third of its imports from China, non-oil imports. And India's telecom runs on Huawei equipment for the most part. So the relations between India and China economically have intensified, even though they have got some very serious strategic issues. Japan and Korea are a very different issue. The Japanese have made a decision that they want to ally with the United States to try to limit the rise of China at all costs. I think there are many reasons for that. One is historical. Japanese nationalism has clashed with China in tragic and terrible ways many times in the past, and there is certainly a nationalist element in Prime Minister Kishida's attitude towards China. The other thing is, in terms of economics, China is a major threat to Japanese industry. Japan's biggest export industry, of course, is automobiles. In the first quarter of this year, China surpassed Japan's auto exports. I spoke yesterday to a senior Japanese diplomat who told me that he thought Honda Motors might not survive because the Chinese have been so effective in producing low-cost electric vehicles that they may wipe out the export market of some of the major Chinese auto companies, major Japanese auto companies. So Japan has reasons to want to stop the rise of China. Korea is a different case. Korea depends on the United States for security reasons. They have North Korea, which is a significant threat, and they want American protection. On the other hand, South Korea is deeply enmeshed in the Chinese economy. China is their largest trading partner. There's enormous amounts of investment as well. The South Koreans build computer chips in plants in China, so it's very difficult to disentangle that. So South Korea is yet another problem. So if you take these three important countries, India, Japan, and South Korea, they're all very different individual situations. And you have to look at them in their particularity. There's no single dominating theme.
And in general, this multipolar future, what can this multipolar future bring to China in terms of collaborations and rivalries, for example? So how we can imagine this whole situation in the future?
There are many ways this could develop. It could develop in a cooperative way. In terms of economic theory, there's no reason why China's rise should necessarily be damaging to the United States, although it very well could be. Look at England versus the United States, for example. England and America were allies, but America ruined England's industrial economy. After World War II, the United States basically wiped England out. We also took away their empire. And the decline of English industry is very much a result of the rise of American industry. Chinese economists point to the rivalry between the United States and England as an example of what they want to do. In the 19th century, for example, England had the technology. America was not a technological power. We simply had the ability to implement industries on a grand scale. So, for example, Thomas Edison, the American inventor, every American school child thinks that Edison invented the light bulb. He didn't. He stole it from an English physicist. He was sued and he had to pay an enormous settlement for intellectual property theft. But nonetheless, Edison commercialized the light bulb at a much bigger scale than anyone in England. So it could go that way, where Chinese industry ruins American industry by being more efficient, lower cost, and so forth. Or you could have a situation in which the United States specializes in certain areas and dominates them, and China specializes in other areas, and there's a cooperative agreement. What worries me most is the possibility of a military misjudgment over Taiwan, which could lead to really tragic consequences.
What do you mean by that?
Well, Taiwan, of course, is a democratic country. It was taken over by the Nationalist Army in 1947 when the communists won the Chinese Civil War. The Taiwanese like their political system. They certainly don't want to, the majority do not want to be ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. On the other hand, from the standpoint of the Beijing regime, and indeed any Chinese regime, Taiwan is Chinese territory. So, for example, if someone told us in the United States that we had to give up Florida or Alaska or Hawaii, we wouldn't accept that. We wouldn't accept anything that damaged the integrity of the United States. And China won't accept that either. So if the United States, for example, were to support an independence movement towards Taiwanese sovereignty, then that might lead to a military confrontation. China would not tolerate that. And there are many people in the United States who think we should do that. That's not our official policy, but it's certainly an important current of opinion. I believe that the new missile technology, which has developed in the last few years, particularly hypersonic missiles, has changed the military balance fundamentally. Right now, surface ships are really pretty vulnerable. There's no way to defend them. There's no defense against hypersonic missiles. So in most of the war games that we've seen, most of the analysis, China can sink America's aircraft carriers within hundreds of miles of its coast, and indeed all surface ships. And the danger, if we got into a confrontation and the Chinese, God forbid, sank an American aircraft carrier, is that we might have an escalation towards a nuclear war. That scenario has been widely discussed. Admiral Stavridis, the former commander of Pacific Forces, wrote a novel about that last year called 2034, which is a sadly realistic scenario for how a crisis over Taiwan might indeed escalate towards a nuclear war. And I think it's the responsibility of all sane people to avoid such an escalation at all costs, because that would be a tragedy of unimaginable size.
We all hope we can avoid having this trouble in our life. Mr. Goldman, thank you very much for this very precious discussion and conversation.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Önöknek köszönöm megtisztelő figyelmüket, tartsanak velünk legközelebb is, addig kövessenek bennünket Facebook és Instagram oldalainkon, illetve műsorainkat visszanézhetik, visszahallgathatják YouTube és podcast csatornáinkon is. Köszönjük még egyszer a figyelmet, viszontlátásra, minden jót kívánok!